Today marks 1 year since U.S. President Donald Trump took office, and Canada's relationship with our neighbors south of the border is nearly unrecognizable. New tariffs on Canadian goods, along with threats of turning us into the 51st state, were just the beginning, it seems. Now, old alliances like NATO are at risk of collapse, and the Western world is facing a deeply uncertain future. Joining us with both a recap on the last year and a look ahead to what 2026 could look like is Rob Goodman. He is an associate professor of politics and public administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. And you used to work, where did you point this to me here?
I think right in that door somewhere back there.
That used to be one of your offices. All right, first of all, how does the Trump we have today differ than the President Trump we saw first term, starting 2016?
Yeah, I think one thing we saw in the first term is that Trump was still surrounded with some establishment figures, some holdovers from past Republican administrations, some holdovers from figures in the bureaucracy and the military. That's not really the case this time. He has purged the circle of people around him. He's purged the military. He's purged the bureaucracy. He is surrounded by a much tighter circle of white nationalists, essentially, people like Stephen Miller, who are dictating the policy of this administration towards much more, I think, openly white nationalist ideological ends. The administration has a much clearer idea this time around, I think, of what its goals are and how to manipulate and use the federal bureaucracy. I think they're much more prepared to carry out that Project 2025 agenda we heard so much about.
The U.S. government system consists of many checks and balances. They were put in place and designed to rein in a president's full power. Judges play a key role in that function. Yet Trump's move to deport people to foreign prisons with no due process, that's a violation of law. His tariffs might also be unconstitutional. Why does it seem like the rules don't apply to him?
Well, I would say the U.S. used to be a system defined by checks and balances. I know that's a version we learn in civics classes. Sometimes that's still the version I teach to my students. But the point is, the U.S. political system is in crisis right now. And what we're seeing Donald Trump carry out and get away with, I think, doesn't just get chalked up to his capabilities as a politician or his control over the party, but to this long-standing crisis in American politics that's been developing for quite some time. We've seen the collapse of Congress as sort of an independent check on the executive, the consolidation of an executive that claims unlimited power over federal agencies, and now under President Trump, even unlimited power to impose tariffs, to control spending unilaterally, all sorts of things that the founders didn't really envision, all sorts of things that the founders identified as tyranny, as things that the Constitution is supposed to guard against. And at the same time, the Supreme Court, which has been stacked by Republicans, and many of whose justices are appointed by President Trump, has been very compliant with this sort of agenda. Its rulings about presidential power have really paved the way for this. What we see is a system that I think is still, by the letter of the law, a system of checks and balances, but in terms of actual practice and fact, is much more like an authoritarian system, is much more like one-man personalist rule. And of course, that's very frightening.
I'm going to pick up on the word you used, which is crisis, because that seems to dominate this current version of his administration. Trump loves an emergency. He signed an executive order that declared a national emergency to stop the seizure of Venezuelan oil, or held by the U.S. He declared that economic practices and trade created a national emergency, and that justified the tariffs we saw in Canada. And then he declared an energy emergency to bypass environmental regulations. And now there's talk of again, in Minnesota, bringing in the military, again, with this exception rule. So what are the ways he could continue to use emergencies to push his agenda in 2026, particularly with the midterm elections coming?
Well, I think what you said is right on point. The idea that this expansion of presidential powers is carried out under this cover of emergency. And it doesn't really matter what the emergency is.
He's told the American people they are in crisis. Exactly.
That is consistently how fascism works. And I think there's much less doubt this time around that President Trump is a fascist. That fascism works by putting society into a state of constant crisis, constant panic, constant emergency, in which it seems natural to want to consolidate under the leader, in which it seems natural to want to purge your society of outsiders and band together against foreign enemies, whoever they might be. That's how fascism works in all times and places. So I think it's not surprising that we see these narratives of crisis that are both about consolidating power and also about, to the extent possible, generating consent for what really looks like a campaign of ethnic cleansing. What we're seeing in Minneapolis, what we see the federal government carrying out, specifically targeted against people of color, it is absolutely a racialized campaign of terror conducted by the government. And I think the only way that the Trump administration can plausibly justify this is as some kind of emergency. But the interesting thing is that claim, despite their use of it, hasn't really caught on, I think, to the extent that they expect. I think it's not really popular. I think the popular resistance to these sorts of policies in places like Minneapolis and the protests that mobilized against the administration last fall are really striking. So I think the contrast is between an administration that really is committed to pushing an emergency narrative and a broader public that, for the most part, I still think doesn't buy it.
So I wanted to ask you about that because, you know, we say on this side of the border it doesn't seem to be popular, but how do we know that? We also see, if you know, when you go on social media, when you watch people who are there, there is a strong support for this president and what they feel is the protection of America. So where do Americans land in this administration as we look ahead to 2026?
Yeah, well, I think it's absolutely true that there is a strong support, strong floor of support for far-right policies, for white nationalist policies, for authoritarian policies, maybe 30, 40%. I mean, if you study American history, it's been like that for quite a lot of American history. But I think the more encouraging fact is that, on the whole, Trump's popularity right now is very low. His handling of immigration is very unpopular. He is less popular at this point in his term than Obama was, than Bush was at similar points in their terms, and they were all wiped out in midterms. So I think the interesting thing is the conflict between that and popularity and the fact that the administration is also acting like popularity doesn't matter. It's acting like it doesn't really expect to be held to public account.
He may be struggling in the polls now, but does the MAGA movement end with him as we look ahead, possibly to 2028? There's, you know, he's already made the caps that say Trump 2028, and there's also J.D. Vance waiting in the wings. What does it look like down the road?
I think that's absolutely the question. I don't think anyone has a solid prediction about that, but I think what's really interesting is when we see these sort of personalist or charismatic regimes around the world in places like Latin America, in European dictatorships and so on, what we have often seen is an attempt to sort of inherit the mantle of the leader after he passes on, whether he just expires or whether his term in office comes to an end. Whatever it is, there's going to be a contest to inherit that mantle. But what I would suggest is successors to these charismatic personalist leaders have often gone quite far by sort of incarnating that leader and sort of pretending to represent the leader and carry his or her legacy forward. And what I think is so interesting about American politics right now, interesting and scary, is I think the threat of a fascist movement, the threat of MAGA in American politics, I don't think is going to expire with Trump. I think it's going to be a structural feature of American politics unless there are really serious constitutional reforms that attack the basis of far-right power and that attack the roots of this constitutional crisis. But that would be on par with Reconstruction. I think that's what America's up against.
Rob Goodman, it was great to have you here. I wish I could have you for another 10 minutes. I do have to let you go. But thanks for joining us, taking a look at 1 year in the second time in office with President Trump. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
If you like that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.